I just wanted to say thank you for being here, and really excited, that you're doing this talk for us today. And I've had the pleasure of meeting you in Frome in various different projects and guises, and it's always been really lovely to speak with you, and the depth of knowledge that Elise has and the experience, the wealth of experience that she brings, both from her background growing up in Ohio and being really involved in food production systems from a really young age, having then a wealth of knowledge from projects all around the world, which you've been involved in community development and food systems, from kind of Asian countries, Latin American countries, African countries, where you've both lived and worked with communities, and specifically worked around food, and specialized as a food and farming consultant, I guess, for want of a better word, and now sort of researcher at the University of Sussex. So, sharing your wisdom with us in that way. So we're really fortunate to have this global expert, if you like, here with us in Frome, and that we can even meet you on the streets, which is even better, in my view. So I'll hand over to you, and thanks very much for coming.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Yeah, I don't know what I would add, but in terms of practicalities, I'm wondering how I can share my screen so you can see my slides. Oh, there it is, share screen. Screen, there we go, okay. Okay.
Yeah, you can see that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the warm welcome. I really appreciate being able to share this research with people in my own community. Yeah, one of the reasons I haven't been to a Sustainable Frome meeting before is that the last few years I've been doing my PhD, and if anyone knows anything about that process, it's so heady that kind of the last thing I wanted to do in my evenings was talk about anything related. So I usually find myself dancing or something else. Anyways, I am a food producer. I've been producing food on and off since I was a kid in a variety of contexts, and I'm a researcher, as Maddie says, at Sussex University. And this research was commissioned by a local group down in Bridport, a transition town type group, actually a deep adaptation group, and they wanted to know how they as local citizens could start to facilitate adaptations to climate change, and particularly related to food. So let's see, I've never done an online presentation like this before, so you have to bear with me. But the first thing, actually, before we get into the presentation itself, is a poll, which I'm new to on Zoom also. So I think Mike can pull up poll number 1. And just to get a sense of the group, how people are feeling about climate change and how it might affect their food security in this area in the next 20 to 30 years.
Actually, Elise, it's all in one poll with different questions. So if you want people to just do question 1, just do question 1 before I launch it. All the questions.
Oh yeah, just do question 1.
I'm not sure it let us do it because we have to.
Doesn't let you do it. Okay, well maybe we do show of hands.
Does it not let you do it?
No.
No, you have to submit all of them. And I don't want you to look at all of them yet.
Okay. Maybe there's a way we could. Okay. Hold on just a second. Oops, not that. Maybe we could do it in chat. No, this hasn't worked. So what you have to, I can't, because I can't see what you can see.
We have a whole list of the questions, and
Yeah,
unless you
I can only see results. I can't see.
Why don't we do it in chat or show it?
Yep.
I don't understand question 4.
Are you sure? Look at the other questions.
We're not on question 4, Sue. Just
All right.
one.
Oh, we're all dicey. Sorry.
But why don't we just move on? Because it's going to take me.
We've had a time to reflect on how concerned you are. Maybe just a show of hands of who in this group is either quite concerned or like feels a bit hopeless about it.
Concerned.
Which is probably why you're in the talk. Great. Okay. So one of the reasons why this study was done is because there's been a lot of talk about the catastrophe for our global food supplies in the face of climate change in the future. And there's been a whole host of studies about multiple breadbasket failures, which has its own acronym now of MBBF. And people have kind of said there's another Dust Bowl type situation coming, similar to what happened in the United States in the 1930s. And in response to that, there's kind of different, largely technological approaches which have been proposed. And one of them, which has been proposed by Jem Bundle from the Deep Adaptation Movement, based on an agronomist in France, is this idea that we need to grow a lot of our crops under polytunnels, so in plastic sheeting, in order to protect them from storms, in order to provide shade and shaded polytunnels and conserve moisture and irrigation. And this doesn't really sit right with me, because if you see the photo on the left is an aerial photo from Almeria in Spain of these deserts of plastic. And it's where we get a lot of our food from in the UK. And to me, this doesn't really seem like our solution in terms of how to have a sustainable food system. The other kind of extreme approach which has been proposed is the photo on the right, which is these lab-grown foods, where George Monbiot has proposed that we can kind of ditch most of our farming and grow all of the carbohydrates and fats and proteins that we need based on bacterial fermentation in labs. And that doesn't sit right with me either, because I think, there's so much that can be missed in terms of the complexity of what foods we need when we try to engineer everything with precision. So, and the other reason why I think neither of these solutions is the solution is because in terms of the Dust Bowl, what people don't really recognize enough is that, yes, there were climatic factors that led to a lot of drought and wind and dust and whatnot, but it was largely the landscape changes that had exacerbated those climate effects. So in this photo, you can see there's like really deep ridges in the hill. That's from a lack of vegetation. And there have been these really significant landscape changes and farming changes from the late 1800s until the 1930s that had kind of set the US up for the changes they experienced. And we can see this in other places as well. So in Nicaragua was one of the countries that was really badly hit by Hurricane Mitch in 1998. And prior to the hurricane, there had been a number of initiatives which had been working with smallholders and farmers to try to get them to use more sustainable and ecological practices. And so after the hurricane hit, those organizations, they did this huge survey, a big study, where they went out to 880 different plots and tried to assess the effect of the hurricane on these different farms. And what they found was that the ones that had adapted these ecological measures had 40% more topsoil, 20% more vegetative cover. They lost less of their arable land. They had less incidence of landslides, less rill erosion. Those are those deep ridges. gully erosion or even deeper ridges. And so, you know, it's not that they weren't affected at all, but compared to the normal farming of the time, they had much less loss of their crops and of their soil and of their land. So it's in that kind of context that I want to talk a bit about what the types of farming practices could be helpful in the face of our changing climate. So first, I want to talk a little bit about what the climate changes are expected to be in the Southwest, what that means for crop production, the adaptive practices that could help, and a bit about why those practices aren't really mainstream, because you know, a lot of people kind of just blame the farmers of like, oh, these lazy farmers who don't care about the environment. And there's quite a lot of factors involved in terms of why they're not adapted. And then lastly, a bit about what citizens can actually do. There's a lot that we can do at a national level and that we need to be doing at a national level, but then also a lot of things we can do locally. And just to say that this study was funded by Seeding Our Future, the organization in Bridport, and that because of the scope, we had kind of a limited budget and time, we focus on plant-based foods. It's not to say that there's zero possibility that animal-based foods could be incorporated in a sustainable way, but we focus kind of, you know, on plants and crops for this. So in terms of future conditions, one of the things we're expected to see, which might not be a huge surprise, is hotter, drier summers. So by the end of this decade, we could see almost 2 degrees rise in average summer temperatures and 6 degrees by the 2070s. We could see 50% less rainfall by 2050. And then the consecutive days over 30 degrees Celsius, which in this country is considered a heat wave, would be twice as likely by 2050. And then also there's more chance, despite the dryness, there's more chance of high intensity storms in the summers. And all that being said, it's not like we can plan entirely for our summers to be hot and dry, because there's still a chance that the odd summer is going to be cool and wet. The other thing is warmer, wetter winters, which again, you've probably noticed already a bit of a trend. So precipitation is expected to increase by 20% by the end of this decade. Winters are expected to be 1.4 degrees Celsius warmer by the end of this decade. But then again, there's a chance of an odd cold and dry winter. And then people ask a lot about sea levels and about pests and disease. There's a possibility that some new pests and diseases will emerge as they kind of move further north with the warmer climate, but then others will decline. So there's a lot of uncertainty around what pests and diseases might actually be in the future. Rising sea levels are only expected to affect about 10% of England's agricultural land, but that includes 50% of its grade 1 agricultural land. Grade 1 is the type of land that's the most productive, and that's because a lot of it's in a floodplain. But then in the southwest of England, of all the areas of England, we're expected to have the least loss of land to flooding or sea level rise. So in terms of what this means for farming in the southwest of England, there's an increased risk of erosion and runoff. There's risk of pressure on our groundwater reserves as farmers irrigate, risk of crop losses due to drought and storms and pests. There's very low risk of land loss to sea level rises, but there is a necessity to change some of the crops. So rapeseed is likely to become a bit less viable down south, but then sunflowers are expected to be more viable. Brassicas that form a curd, so cauliflowers and Brussels sprouts, they need a cold winter temperature in order to form that curd, and they can also be negatively affected by the wetness, like the extra damp. And so those brassicas might not be as viable, and there are a fair few cauliflower farms in the southwest. And then one of the maybe sadder things is they also require a low temperature in the winter in order to induce dormancy, which is important for bud break. And so without the cold of the winters, it's likely that apples will be less and less viable. but then apricots will be more and more viable. So there's kind of some winning and some losing involved. Overall, the Southwest is definitely can be a good place to produce food in the future, but producers need to be more resilient to these changes. So, so I'll talk a bit about what practices that might entail. There was another poll, but maybe we skip it. But if you want to reflect, yeah, I wanted to know, in your opinion, how resilient you consider the farming practices around Frome in the face of climate change. So maybe you can do it by hand. So not resilient at all. 1. Meh, they might stand a chance. 2, 3. And they'll probably be all right. And they're absolutely resilient, nothing to worry about. Okay. I'd probably put it the first one or the second one, to be fair. So in terms of adaptive practices, reducing flooding and soil erosion, this is like, even if climate didn't change at all from what it is now, this is absolutely needed. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of how much runoff we get into our rivers and how much pollution, how we're losing so much of our topsoil every year. There's quite a lot of alarming figures around that, and if that gets worse, then we're in quite a lot of trouble. So one way is to use swales to channel water. So the middle picture here they're basically ditches, where you would kind of dig ditches along contour lines or key lines in the landscape, and then either you can, as the photo here shows, that allows the water to infiltrate in the soil rather than just running straight down the hill. Or if your soil isn't very permeable, you can use them to kind of channel the water into ponds and reservoirs, which is, great if you want to use the water in the summer. You can plant more shrubs and trees along key lines. So key lines are these kind of points in the landscape. It's an inflection point. I don't want to go into too much detail, but you can ask me about it if you're curious. Cultivating with the contour rather than up and down the slope, because if you have these rows that go kind of up and down the slope, then the water is just like a slide. It'll go straight down rather than going into the soil. It washes your soil away with it. And then keeping soils covered. This is essential, and it's something I really rarely see in England. Using cover crops in the winter and then intercropping, so that you never have any bare soil. So the top photo in this is the rows of onions with a vetch in between. And vetch is a green manure, so it fixes nitrogen into the soil. And apologies if I get too agricultural on you. So basically, this slide is like what not to do. So this is Jersey potato planting in Jersey.
Dreadful.
So they've put plastic sheeting on the ground to warm it up, which is common practice, so that they can plant a bit earlier. Imagine what happens if it rains, where the water's going to go. It's going to go downhill and cause some flooding somewhere else. And then they're planting the potatoes, on these lines. So it's like it's really not what you want to do. And there's lots of examples of this around Frome. I often take photos of practices around here. In terms of droughts, capturing and storing rainwater is the most important thing, obviously, that prevents people from putting pressure on groundwater reserves if they have to irrigate in a really dry summer or spring like we've had. And that can be done with those swales and whatnot. Obviously, soil itself is a great place to store water, but then, ponds, basins, tanks, keeping soils covered. So the photo in the right is, that's actually a slurry truck, but instead of slurry, it's spreading grass clippings over a field of potatoes. So that's a much better way of doing it, so that the soil is covered, and then that prevents the water from evaporating. And it also prevents runoff if it does rain. So that would be called a mulch. Again, cover crops. Intercropping is a big one. And then reducing the tillage. So many of you will probably know Charles Dowding near Bruton. He's a big advocate of no-dig agriculture. You can do it on any scale, whether it's tiny like in the photo or on a really large scale. and you don't need to use herbicides for it. And the photo here of those two beds, the left one, they've both had the same amount of compost applied to them, and the left one has been dug, they dug it in, and the right one hasn't been dug, and this is months later. And you can see that the one on the right has much more water retention in the soil. The soil is more moist. And then if people are going to irrigate, that it be very well designed and efficient, which I won't go on about to you because I don't know if it's the most pressing point of this presentation for you to know all about irrigation. But then in terms of another way to improve resilience is really kind of common sense of not putting all of our eggs in one basket and to have diversity. And diversity can be done on a genetic level, on a crop level, and at a landscape level. So at the genetic level, what I'm showing in this field of wheat, often farmers only they crop only one variety of wheat. They'll choose a variety for the season, and then they plant the whole field of one variety. What this person, the late Professor Martin Wolf, did is he took 20 varieties that were really good, either because they were high yielding or because they were resistant to rust or a certain pest or drought. And he crossed them all, and he got 200 varieties, and then he just plants the whole lot. And so he's growing 200 varieties of wheat, and in trials, basically, that population is what it's called. It's done totally fine, whereas in like 2017, another hard year for farming, the conventional wheat at the time had completely failed. So basically it enables, if you have 200 varieties, there's a good chance that some of them are going to work in the climatic conditions that you have. Heritage varieties are also really good in that they in themselves have more genetic diversity than seeds that have been bred more formally for uniformity. Crop species diversity, this is what you're seeing on the photo on the right at the Eden project. So this is having lots of different crops in your field. It's great because, if a pest or a disease is kind of spreading, then they're not going to just be able to wipe out the whole thing. They're blocked by a row of marigolds or a row of leeks or something. If they're after the cabbage. So it can really help with pests and diseases. And also, again, if it's not a good year for sunflowers, but it's a really good year for beans and you've got both, then, you're more resilient. So this is called intercropping. Beans and grains is kind of one of the typical ones and can be done at a field scale. And then non-crop biodiversity is really important, integrating shrubs and trees and all of these things. That gives a habitat for the predators of pests to survive. So basically, if you have a field full of one crop that a certain pest likes to eat, they're going to grow quite a lot. But then if you have habitats for other insects that might eat that pest, then that's really helpful. Basically trying to create a good ecosystem in your field or in your garden. So I'm curious as to whether any of you have seen any of these practices around Frome. Has anyone seen people using mulches, like I showed, like kind of spreading grass clippings or anything on top of soil? No. Oh, Joe.
I work on a biodynamic organic farm, and we do all of these things.
Yeah, they're very common sense.
Yeah.
And there's more. I should say, if you're really interested in this topic, the report goes into much, much more depth. I'm trying to not go too far into it because I know that we're not all farmers on the call. Swales or key lines or any kind of these things to reduce erosion or channel water. Anyone seen that around?
We've got some swales. We have got an issue with that. We've got very heavy clay soil that's very wet. Yeah.
So in that case, it's really good if you might consider like lining the swale so then it's more funneling the water rather than trying to get it into the soil.
Yeah.
Intercropping, has anyone seen any intercropping around Frome? Other than Joe?
I mean, obviously, I'm at Vallis Veg, and they use all of
Yeah.
that stuff. But we're not talking about these little pockets of joy, are we? We're talking about what's going on around Frome, and no.
Yeah. So I mean, that's it, isn't it? I mean, we might see little pockets of exceptions, but for the most part, these aren't really practices that are mainstream or widely practiced. So yeah, what prevents them from being undertaken? But before we talk about what prevents them from being undertaken, I want to talk a little bit about yields, because this is something that comes up quite a lot. Some of these practices can possibly reduce yields. So heritage grains, for example, they have lower yields per acre than a lot of the modern varieties, but then they're more resilient to a shock. Some of them are also kind of more labor intensive. So if you're kind of working on a farm you have to pay labor, then you're going to try to reduce the costs. So people have said, like, oh, we can't feed the world with organic farming because it's lower yielding, and then other people say, no, it's much higher yielding because it's got all this, intercropping and whatnot. The jury's kind of out globally about whether it's lower yielding or higher yielding. But what people often don't really talk about in those debates is how our land use at the moment is highly inefficient. And what I mean by that is that instead of, cropping potatoes at a small scale and doing grains and pulses for local consumption, it's much easier, more economically efficient for farmers to do animal feed and biofuels or kind of produce for large scale grain. So just to kind of explain a little bit about what I mean by that, like in Totnes, there was a project that they wanted to work with the local grain farmers to get them to supply grains not for animals to be eating, but for like their local bakeries. So they said, okay, we're going to arrange all these contracts and get them. They're producing oats anyway, so we'll get them to produce oats for our bakery and maybe a few other things. And then what they found was that what's clean and dry for animals is really different than what's clean and dry for human consumption. And to get it clean and dry for human consumption, they needed to have, they needed to find suddenly these drying facilities and these cleaning facilities, and all of that costs money. And basically a lot of the farmers don't have that because they just sell to a big intermediary and they provide all that for them. Biofuels, at certain points in time, they give a greater return on investment than growing, rye for rye bread. And then a lot of those, the farmers who are actually producing grain for human consumption, it goes towards, it goes into these, a lot of it ends up being used for foods that we don't need to be eating. So cakes, ultra processed foods, basically like very unhealthy things that aren't actually contributing to our human diet. So if we were actually to use our land for what we need to be eating, and this is even regardless of like whether we eat meat or not eating meat, we'd need to use a lot less land in order to produce more than we need. So just to kind of like give you a flavor of how much, if you were to guess like how much of our wheat production in the UK goes towards healthy diets. Anyone think all of it does? No, 75%. 50%. Oh, you guys, 25%. Yeah, but it's actually, or none. It's actually 50%. So what it means is that we, even if we were to use a practice that were half as productive, if we actually use our land for what we need to be eating as humans, and that would be totally fine. And if it were 75% as productive, it's a bonus. So this is something that's really overlooked in all of these discussions and debates about what's more productive and do we need to have these super high-tech practices. People forget about, well, what are we using our land for and how is that decided? There we go. So in terms of whether the UK could feed itself, the UK is already self-sufficient in grains despite all of these inefficiencies. If we prioritised, our dietary needs, we could account for lower yields with climate change and with these different practices. For pulses, if we stopped feeding them to our animals, then we could grow more of them for humans. With oils, like I said, rapeseed, it might need to shift further north, but sunflower might become more viable in the south. Vegetables, we used to be more than self-sufficient in vegetables and fruits. Now we only supply 53% of our own fruit, veg and 17% of our own fruit. That's by economic value. So things like raspberries, they cost a lot more, but they don't necessarily give us a good portion. So it's a bit misrepresented, that figure. It's probably less, is what I'm trying to say. And the thing to really recognise is that the countries where we get a lot of our fruit and veg from are expected to have much more water scarcity than the UK. So if we were concerned about the security of our supply of vegetables, then we'd want to start producing more of our own here. And then the UK is fairly self-reliant in starches and potatoes, and actually root vegetables are expected to actually benefit from the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we have quite a lot more of that, and that's expected to outweigh any reductions in yield due to drought. So there's not a huge risk in that, other than if the field gets flooded. So in terms of what we can do locally to enable adaptation, we know that we can produce enough food to feed ourselves. It's probably a good idea to maybe, people have different ideas about whether we should be freely trading and whatnot, and that's fine. But in terms of if we're concerned about food availability going down in the world, and we're not really producing as much as we can or orienting our farmland in a way to feed ourselves, and it's maybe a bit something we want to look at. But in terms of what we can do to enable these kind of more ecological, more resilient practices, looking at the economic challenges, like I say, some of them require more labor, and that means that they cost more to produce. So even spreading mulches and things, it takes hours. Picking vegetable by hand, it takes time. So that's one reason why a lot of farmers don't use a lot of these practices. Again, if you're using heritage varieties or things like this, then you might have reduced yields compared to the really high yielding things. So that can be another deterrent to some farmers. Another thing is that a lot of these changes that I'm talking about require upfront investment. So if you're going to install a reservoir for rainwater or get some swales dug and this kind of thing, then that requires some cash flow and also an awareness of the need. Obviously, doing anything new brings risks, and farmers are very understandably very risk averse, particularly the ones whose livelihood actually depends on what they produce. Like I said, healthy diets aren't always what's profitable to produce for, and then a lot of that processing, like I say, is centralized. So there's 4 main grain traders in the whole world, and that's kind of all oriented towards uniformity. So in terms of what, again, lots of this requires national level action, but in terms of local level things that we can do, aside from farming itself, one thing is community supported agriculture schemes. So these are basically where the risks and rewards are shared between the consumers and producers. So you might sign up for a whole year and commit to getting a veg box from a local farm. And then in response, then you're going to get a share of the harvest. And if it's a lower harvest, you get less. If it's a great harvest, you're laughing because you've got lots of veg. So it's a really good way spreading the risks. It's also good in terms of it reduces the intermediary costs. So most of them it's direct from the farm to the producer. So it means that the farm's getting a higher percentage of the food cost. And it also means that farms can kind of like mix the less profitable foods in with the more profitable foods. So it means that they can actually produce potatoes rather than having them done at large scale and buying them in. Not always, but so community supported agriculture schemes are really good for a lot of these types of, well, they're good for cost risks and making that healthy food production a bit more viable. Community intermediaries, what I mean by this is there's this fantastic organization down in Plymouth called Tamar Grow Local. Has anyone ever heard of it? They're basically, they've got this fantastic, they've got a number of schemes, that's why it's hard to know where to start. One of them is a grow, share, cook scheme is what it's called. And what they've done is they've coordinated the vegetable producers in the local area so that they're not kind of duplicating and competing against one another in terms of what they're producing. And they're buying their vegetables and then they're making them into veg bags, which they call veg bags because veg boxes were seen to have some middle class connotations. And you can go to your local food bank and get a veg bag in return for going to some cooking classes. And that's because a lot of people don't know anymore, they never got to learn how to cook with these basic raw ingredients. That's one of the things they do. They also run a number of cooperatives. They have like a stall at the farmers market. They're kind of trying to they're trying to be the intermediary between the producers and the consumers in a way that doesn't put all the pressure on the producers to be marketing themselves and all of this stuff. So it helps in that way. It reduces. It enables producers to have more of the value of the food. It addresses this thing of healthy foods not being profitable, and it also helps in terms of the risks. Because it's giving that certainty that we're going to buy our veg, and we're working through our local council, and you know, we're definitely going to buy it all year. Another thing is producer cooperatives. So this is more known about, obviously. There's a great Southwest Seed Savers cooperative nearby. This can be great for allowing farmers to actually process or store their food. So down in Dorset, Five Penny Farm has a really lovely facility for you know, cider making and apple juicing and dairy production. It also enables people to pool resources, which reduces a lot of their costs. And then for some cases, it can kind of reduce the upfront investment if it's a shared resource. And then the last thing, and then I'm almost done talking actually, is just some startup and transition grants, because again, some of these things require upfront investment. So whether it's, you know, building a water reservoir or, you know, looking at your landscape or planting some trees, that can really help with that. It can also help with new risks. With us at Broomfield at Fort, starting up, so we're starting up a vegetable business, and there are a lot of risks in starting up and also a lot of costs. And so those types of grants can really help people get going. And then they can also help with this thing of you know, which foods are actually profitable to be producing. Depending on what they're for, you can also use a startup grant for centralized processing. So that's it really. I mean, basically, in my opinion, climate change has some challenges and risks, but resilience, in my experience, can absolutely be built. And but we need to be aware that, you know, changing crops and changing practices, it takes time, and it is something that needs to really start now. And I do think that in the Southwest, you know, and definitely around Frome, we have the producers and communities and the willingness to actually make these changes. So